Catherine Walsh arrived at the remote Wyoming cattle ranch in November 1874 with no shoes on her bleeding feet, her wedding dress torn to ribbons by 3 days of walking through sleet and frozen mud, her lips so cracked and swollen she could barely whisper the name of the man she had traveled 1,500 miles to marry. And when the ranch hands found her collapsed against the barn door in the pre-dawn darkness, they saw in her eyes a terror so profound that not one of them dared ask what had happened to the stagecoach, or the driver, or the other passengers who should have arrived with this bride, who came barefoot in the storm. She had been beautiful once. You could see that in the bones of her face, but the storm had stripped away everything except the will to survive. And as the cowboys carried her into the bunkhouse and wrapped her in blankets that steamed with her fever, she kept repeating that something was wrong, that the cowboy she had come to marry needed to know that something was terribly wrong, that the men who had taken her shoes and killed the others were not finished, that they were coming to this ranch, that the storm had saved her, but it would not save him. The cowboys sent for Lucas Brennan, the foreman she had come west to wed after 6 months of letters exchanged through a matrimonial service, and when he arrived and saw what remained of his intended bride, saw the barefoot woman shivering in blankets with her wedding dress hanging in tatters and her eyes fixed on the door as if death itself might walk through at any moment, he understood that Catherine Walsh had not simply survived a storm, but had escaped from something far worse, and that whatever evil had pursued this bride through the frozen November landscape was still out there in the darkness, waiting. If stories of survival against impossible odds and the courage it takes to trust a stranger when terror has broken you speak to something deep in your soul, subscribe now, because this journey will test everything you believe about what one person will do to protect another when danger arrives barefoot in the storm. Lucas Brennan was 41 years old in that winter of 1874, a man who had spent 20 years working cattle across Wyoming Territory and Montana, who had fought in the war and buried a wife and son to typhoid, and had learned through hard experience that loneliness could kill a man as surely as a bullet or a blizzard. He had answered the matrimonial advertisement not out of romantic hope, but from a simple recognition that he needed a partner to help run the ranch he was building in the shadow of the Bighorn Mountains, a spread of 2,000 acres that demanded more than one person could give. Catherine Walsh had written to him from Pennsylvania, 26 years old, a school teacher whose own loneliness had driven her to seek a new life in the territories, and her letters had been honest and practical and devoid of the fantasies that so many Eastern women brought to their correspondence with Western men. They had agreed to marry upon her arrival, to build something together based on mutual respect and shared labor, and Lucas had sent her the money for passage on the Cheyenne stage, with instructions to arrive in November before the worst of the winter closed the mountain passes. But the bride who had collapsed at his barn door bore little resemblance to the confident woman whose letters he had treasured, and as he knelt beside her in the bunkhouse and took her frozen hands in his own, he saw that something was wrong with her in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion, that whatever she had endured had broken something fundamental in her spirit. She could not speak coherently for the first 12 hours, could only repeat fragments about the storm and the men and the blood in the snow and the ranch hands who had carried her inside, whispered among themselves that the bride had gone mad from exposure, that Lucas should send her back east as soon as the storm cleared, because a crazy woman would be worse than no woman at all on a ranch this isolated. But Lucas saw something in Catherine that the others missed, saw beneath the terror and the exhaustion a core of steel that had allowed her to walk barefoot through a blizzard rather than surrender to whatever fate had claimed the other passengers. And he told his men that the bride would stay, that she would recover, that whatever was wrong would be made right once she was strong enough to tell them what had happened on that stagecoach and why she had arrived at his ranch more dead than alive. He sat with her through that first day and night, spooning broth into her mouth when she could swallow, changing the bandages on her feet that had been cut to ribbons by frozen ground and sharp stones, listening to the fragments of story that emerged between her fever dreams. 3 men, she kept saying, 3 men with dead eyes who had stopped the stage at gunpoint 20 miles south of the ranch. The driver had tried to fight. There had been an old couple, homesteaders returning from Cheyenne, a young man, a miner heading north to the gold fields. The 3 men had shot them all, had stripped the bodies for valuables, had torn open Catherine's bag, looking for the money Lucas had sent for her passage, when they found only her wedding dress and her teaching certificates. They had laughed and said a bride would fetch a good price in the mining camps, that she would earn her keep one way or another. The storm had saved her. A November blizzard that swept down from the mountains with such fury that even the killers had been forced to seek shelter. And in the chaos of wind and sleet, Catherine had run. She had no coat, no shoes, no supplies, only the instinct to flee and the memory of Lucas's letters describing his ranch in the foothills of the Bighorns, 20 miles north of where the stagecoach had stopped. She had walked through that storm for 3 days, had followed the stage road north by memory and desperation, had survived by drinking from half-frozen streams and eating snow and refusing to stop moving, even when every part of her body screamed for rest. She arrived barefoot because the men had taken her shoes along with everything else of value, and she arrived alive because something in her had been too stubborn or too angry or too determined to die in that storm, like the others had died in the snow beside the overturned stagecoach. When she finally woke fully on the 2nd day after her arrival, when the fever had broken and her eyes were clear, she looked at Lucas Brennan and said, "They are coming, the men who killed the others. They know I escaped, and they will come here looking for the bride who got away." Lucas believed her. There was no reason to doubt a woman who had survived what she had survived. And more than that, there was a certainty in her voice that spoke of knowledge rather than fear. The 3 men would come because loose ends were dangerous in a territory where law was scarce and witnesses could hang you, because a bride who had seen their faces and knew their crimes represented a threat that had to be eliminated. The ranch hands wanted to ride south immediately to hunt down the killers before they could reach the ranch, but Lucas understood that such a plan was suicide. 3 professional killers would be watching the approaches, would be expecting pursuit, would pick off any riders long before they reached the site of the massacre. The better strategy was to fortify the ranch, to prepare for a siege, to turn Lucas's carefully built homestead into a fortress that could withstand whatever assault the 3 men might bring. The ranch consisted of a main house built of logs and stone, a bunkhouse that slept 6, a barn large enough to shelter 30 head of cattle, and a root cellar that had been dug deep into the hillside for storing supplies through the long Wyoming winters. Lucas had 4 ranch hands, good men who could shoot straight and follow orders, and with Catherine's warning, they had perhaps 2 days to prepare before the killers arrived. They spent those 2 days transforming the ranch into a defensive position. The barn doors were reinforced with extra timbers. The windows in the main house and bunkhouse were barricaded with furniture and bags of grain, leaving only narrow firing ports. The cattle were moved into the high pasture away from the buildings so they would not be caught in any crossfire. Ammunition was counted and distributed, rifles cleaned and positioned at strategic points throughout the compound. Lucas moved Catherine into the main house, into the bedroom that would have been theirs if circumstances had been different, and he told her to stay there no matter what happened, to keep away from the windows, to understand that the men outside would do everything in their power to get inside and finish what they had started. On that frozen road, Catherine listened to his instructions with the same practical focus that had characterized her letters. And then she asked him for a rifle. When he hesitated, she said, "I did not walk barefoot through a blizzard to hide in a bedroom while men decide my fate. If they are coming for the bride, then the bride should have a say in how this ends." Lucas gave her the Winchester he had carried through the war, showed her how to work the lever action, how to sight down the barrel, how to breathe and squeeze rather than jerk the trigger. She learned quickly, her hands steady despite everything she had endured, and when she fired 3 practice rounds into a target Lucas set up behind the barn, all 3 shots hit center mass. The ranch hands who had whispered about sending her back east stopped whispering and started treating her with the wary respect men reserve for anyone who can shoot straight under pressure. That evening, as the sun set behind the Bighorn Mountains and turned the November sky the color of blood, Catherine stood beside Lucas on the porch of the main house and said, "I came here to marry you, to build a life, to escape the loneliness that was eating me alive back in Pennsylvania. But something went wrong on that stagecoach road, and now I have brought death to your doorstep. If you want me to leave, to draw them away from this place, I will understand." Lucas looked at this woman he had agreed to marry, sight unseen. This bride who had arrived barefoot in a storm with terror in her eyes and steel in her spine. And he said, "You are not going anywhere. Whatever happens in the next few days, we face it together." That was the agreement when you answered my letter. And that agreement holds whether you arrived in a wedding dress or in rags, with shoes on your feet or blood on your soles. You are my responsibility now, Catherine Walsh, and I do not abandon my responsibilities to men who murder travelers and steal from the dead. The 3 men arrived the next morning just after dawn, riding slowly up the approach road with rifles across their saddles and expressions of casual confidence that suggested they expected no real resistance. Lucas watched them through the firing port in the bunkhouse window, studying their movements, their weapons, the way they scanned the ranch buildings for signs of preparation. They were professionals. That much was clear. Men who had killed before and expected to kill again, who saw murder as a trade rather than a crime. The leader was a tall man with a gray beard and eyes that showed no emotion at all, flanked by 2 younger men who moved with the nervous energy of wolves circling prey. They stopped 50 yards from the main house, well outside effective rifle range, and the gray-bearded leader called out in a voice that carried clearly across the frozen ground. "We are looking for a woman who ran from a stagecoach accident south of here. A bride who got confused in the storm. We are here to collect her and return her to her people." Lucas did not answer immediately. He waited. Let the silence stretch. Let the three men understand that their story was not believed and their presence was not welcome. Then he stepped out onto the porch of the main house, his own rifle held casually across his chest, and said, "There was no accident. There was murder. The woman you are looking for is under my protection, and she is not leaving this ranch alive or otherwise. You have one chance to ride away and never come back. After that, we start shooting." Pause here. What would you have done in Catherine's place, knowing that these men had come to your refuge, to the one place you thought might be safe? Would you have hidden, as Lucas asked, or would you have stood beside him and faced the killers who wanted to silence the bride who knew too much? Drop your answer in the comments, because what happens next will determine whether love or death wins this day. The gray, bearded man laughed, a sound without humor that echoed across the ranch yard like the call of a hunting bird. "You are protecting a thief and a liar. That woman stole money from the passengers of that coach, killed the driver when he tried to stop her, ran when we attempted to bring her to justice. We are duly appointed deputies pursuing a criminal, and you are obstructing the law." It was a good lie, delivered with the confidence of men who had used similar stories before, and it might have worked if Lucas had not seen Catherine's feet, had not heard her fever dreams, had not looked into her eyes and recognized the truth that no amount of false testimony could obscure. He said, "Show me your badges. Show me your warrants. Show me any proof that you represent anything except your own greed and violence, and I might reconsider my position. Until then, you are three men on my property making threats against a woman who sought my protection, and Wyoming Territory law gives me the right to defend my home and everyone in it with lethal force." The standoff lasted 3 hours. The three men did not ride away, but they also did not attack, content instead to circle the ranch at a distance, studying the defenses, looking for weaknesses, calculating their chances. Lucas rotated his ranch hands between the various firing positions, ensuring that fresh eyes watched every approach, that no corner of the compound remained unguarded. Catherine stayed in the main house, but refused to remain in the bedroom, instead positioning herself at a window that overlooked the barn, her borrowed Winchester resting on the sill, her eyes tracking the movements of the men who had murdered innocents and would murder again if given the chance. The storm that had saved her life began to build again in the western sky, dark clouds piling up against the mountains, promising another blizzard that might trap everyone at the ranch for days or weeks. Lucas knew that time favored the attackers, that supplies would run short, that men under siege made mistakes born of exhaustion and fear. But he also knew that retreat was not an option, that surrender would mean Catherine's death and quite possibly his own. The attack came at dusk, when the light was failing and shadows made accurate shooting difficult. The three men split up, approaching from different directions simultaneously, using the cover of the barn and the outbuildings to advance toward the main house. Lucas's ranch hands opened fire when the killers came within range, their rifles cracking in the cold air, muzzle flashes bright in the gathering darkness. One of the younger men went down immediately, clutching his leg and screaming, but the gray-bearded leader and his remaining companion reached the barn and took cover behind the thick log walls. They returned fire with a discipline that spoke of military training, their shots carefully aimed at the firing ports in the bunkhouse and main house, forcing Lucas's people to duck away from the windows or risk taking a bullet through the head. The wounded man crawled toward the barn, leaving a trail of blood across the frozen ground, and the gray-bearded leader used the distraction to work his way around to the back of the building where the reinforced door represented the weakest point in the ranch's defenses. Catherine saw him moving through the shadows, saw the way he hugged the barn wall, saw the intent in his movements that signaled he was preparing to breach the door and create an opening into the compound. She did not hesitate, did not call for Lucas, did not wait for permission or instruction. She simply raised the Winchester, sighted on the gray-bearded man's center mass, remembered everything Lucas had taught her about breathing and squeezing, and fired. The rifle's recoil slammed into her shoulder hard enough to bruise, but her shot flew true, catching the gray-bearded leader in the side and spinning him away from the door. He dropped to one knee, clutching the wound, and in that moment, Catherine understood that she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, that she had killed or seriously wounded a human being, that the bride who had arrived barefoot in the storm was now a woman who had defended her life with lethal force. The gray-bearded man did not die immediately. He managed to crawl back to cover, back to where his remaining companion crouched behind a water trough, and together they assessed their situation with the cold pragmatism of professionals who understood when a job had gone wrong. The wounded man by the barn was screaming for help, his cries growing weaker as blood loss took its toll, and the two men still capable of fighting made no move to assist him. Instead, they waited for full darkness, waited for the moment when Lucas's defenders would be firing at shadows and muzzle flashes, and then they attempted one final assault on the main house. They came fast and low, using the dead ground between the barn and the house, firing continuously to keep the defenders' heads down, gambling everything on the chance that they could reach the porch and force their way inside before Lucas's ranch hands could respond. They almost succeeded. The remaining younger man reached the porch steps, his rifle empty but his pistol drawn, and he was raising it to fire through the door when Lucas stepped out from the interior darkness and shot him twice in the chest at point-blank range. The sound of the gunfire inside the enclosed porch was deafening, and the younger man fell backward off the steps, dead before he hit the ground. The gray-bearded leader, wounded and alone, understood that the attack had failed, that the bride who had escaped once would escape again, that his only choice was to retreat or die. He chose retreat, crawling back toward the barn, back toward where the horses were tied, leaving his dead companion on the porch and his dying companion by the barn wall. He managed to reach his horse, managed to pull himself into the saddle despite the wound in his side that was slowly killing him, and he rode away into the gathering storm, heading south toward whatever hell awaited men who murdered innocents and failed to silence the witnesses to their crimes. The ranch was silent after he left, silent except for the moaning of the wounded man by the barn who would die before morning, silent except for the wind beginning to howl as the new blizzard swept down from the mountains, silent except for Catherine's ragged breathing as she stood at the window with the smoking Winchester still clutched in her hands. Lucas found her there an hour later, found the bride who had arrived barefoot, standing in the darkness with tears streaming down her face, and he gently took the rifle from her trembling fingers and pulled her against his chest. She did not speak, could not speak, could only stand there and shake with the aftermath of violence and fear and the terrible understanding that she had taken a human life to preserve her own. Lucas held her and said nothing because there was nothing to say, because some experiences can only be endured rather than explained, because the woman who had written him letters about starting a new life had been forced to defend that life in ways she could never have imagined when she left Pennsylvania 6 weeks earlier. They buried the dead man the next day in the frozen ground behind the ranch, a shallow grave that would have to be deepened in the spring when the earth thawed. The wounded man by the barn had died during the night as predicted, and they buried him beside his companion with no word spoken over either grave, because murderers deserved no prayers and the bride they had hunted deserved no reminders of what she had been forced to do to survive. The gray-bearded leader was never found, though Lucas and his ranch hands rode south when the storm cleared and discovered a frozen body 20 miles down the stage road, a tall man with a gray beard and a bullet wound in his side who had bled out alone in the snow. They reported the deaths to the territorial marshal when he came through in the spring, told the story of the stagecoach massacre and the siege of the ranch, and the bride who had arrived barefoot with death on her heels. And the marshal wrote it all down in his book and said that justice had been served as well as it ever was in Wyoming Territory, where the law was thin and men settled their own accounts. Lucas Brennan and Catherine Walsh were married in the spring of 1875 in a ceremony that took place on the porch of the main house where Lucas had killed a man to protect his bride. Catherine wore a new dress purchased in Cheyenne, and this time she wore shoes, sturdy boots that would never be taken from her again. The ranch hands served as witnesses, and afterward they all shared a meal in the bunkhouse and toasted the couple with whiskey that had been saved for special occasions. Catherine never fully recovered from what had happened on that stagecoach road, and in the days that followed would sometimes wake screaming in the night with dreams of walking barefoot through storms, would sometimes stand at the window with her hands clenched as if still holding a rifle, would sometimes look at Lucas with eyes that held both love and a terrible knowledge of what human beings were capable of doing to one another. But she also built a life with him, worked the ranch through all the seasons, bore 3 children who grew up strong and capable in the shadow of the Bighorn Mountains. And when she was an old woman sitting on that same porch where so much blood had been spilled, she would tell her grandchildren that she had arrived at this ranch as one kind of person and left it as another, that sometimes the storms we survive change us in ways we can never fully understand, that the cowboy who took in a barefoot bride and asked no questions except whether she could shoot straight had saved her life not once, but many times in the years that followed. The story of Catherine Walsh reminds us that survival demands more than physical strength, that courage can be found in the most desperate circumstances, that sometimes the people who save us are the ones we were meant to find all along, even if the path to them leads through hell itself. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of the frontier where ordinary people faced extraordinary challenges and discovered strength they never knew they possessed? Tell me in the comments. Would you have trusted the cowboy if you had arrived barefoot at his door? Or would fear have driven you to keep running into the storm?